All right. Olga Oliker is with the International Crisis Group. Olga, welcome. How are you today?
I'm all right. Thanks for having me back.
Is there any movement towards getting the fighting stopped between Ukraine and Russia?
Not really. I think from the Ukrainian perspective, they have been successful on the battlefield and they see very little reason to stop fighting until and unless the Russians recognize that Ukraine is going to win and therefore surrender. From the Russian perspective, I think there's a belief that they can still break the Ukrainian will and or the will of its Western backers through attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure and through expectations of a cold winter hurting Europe. And therefore, they see no reason to back down as well.
Breaking the will of Western backers, how do you read some of the rhetoric in the United States? I mean, first of all, so a group of Democrats came forward saying, you know, we can't continue to fund billions of dollars, that President Biden should try to urge Ukraine back to the negotiating table. And then later on, they withdrew that. I think they stepped back from that. But
well, it turned out it had been written in the summer when it looked like there was a stalemate and there were a lot of questions about whether or not Ukraine could mount a counteroffensive. So this seems like one of those examples of bureaucracies moving out of line with policies rather than a real effort by members of the Democratic Party to change the president's policy.
Still, it's a sign, I think, and you can disagree, that this is not a never-ending blank check, especially from the U.S. side. And as the midterms happen and you know, you have Republicans taking over the House potentially, there's going to be a lot of debate about how long, you know, the billions of dollars in military equipment keeps getting funneled to Ukraine. Would you agree with that? And Ukraine is under some time pressure in terms of what it's able to do on the ground.
I think there's certainly going to be debate. I think the administration's answer to that debate is going to be that we're not actually doing this as a favor to Ukraine, right? Much as many of America's members of Congress personally care about Ukraine, the real argument here is that if Russia is successful in this war, and if it's successful in this war in part by using nuclear coercion and nuclear threats, then nobody is safe, and certainly nobody in Europe is safe, and that's not something the United States can let stand, and that's why it's supporting Ukraine. So that argument has generally held sway pretty effectively. I would argue that the Russians help it out with the way that they're conducting the war. So I think there will be debate, but one should not mistake debate for the policy falling apart, right? Debate is the mark of a democracy. It does not mean that a country is on the verge of changing its approach.
I don't know if you watched President Putin at the Valdai Institute last week. You probably read his comments regardless. One of the things he talked about was saying that he had never threatened nuclear force. Do you think that's accurate?
So he has taken pains to ensure that no one forgets that Russia has nuclear weapons and to allow some questions as to the conditions under which it might use them. And also in the Valdai conference discussion, there was a point where his interlocutor, Father Lukyanov, asked him, you know, about this directly, and Putin paused, right?
I think 10 seconds.
And then Lukyanov said, you know, you're making us nervous. And Putin said, well, that's the point, right? So that's the point.
Is there, some people have called this mirror imaging, this thing that President Putin does. You know, he accuses other people of threatening nuclear weapons when he did it. They talk about Ukraine preparing a dirty bomb when maybe they're doing that at Zaporizhia, a nuclear power plant, according to the Ukrainians and others. He always twists and turns everything back like a mirror to confuse and obfuscate, and you know it's a very good tactic at creating chaos by people trying to understand what exactly the Kremlin is trying to say.
They're aiming for a certain amount of ambiguity. And I think I actually think the dirty bomb discussion is to place in the press, to place in the debate, some questions about what Ukraine is doing, Ukraine's culpability, the idea that not everything is Russia's fault, just to raise some questions. I think that's at least part of the logic behind those statements and comments. But again, it's meant, as Putin himself said, the intention is to unnerve. The intention is to raise doubts. I think the logic is that Moscow wants adversaries like Ukraine and prospective adversaries to think that its bar for escalation might be lower than it actually is, or at least to wonder if that's the case, and thus ideally be deterred. Right? I think everyone is pretty confident that there's a real risk of Russian nuclear use and attendant escalation if there is a direct war between Russia and NATO member states. So everyone, the Russians and the NATO member states, have been avoiding that. What Russia would like the world to think is that other things well below that threshold could also carry those risks. Now, so far, they haven't. That those threats haven't been credible because Russia isn't willing to take those risks. But this is the game, right? It's a psychological game.
They may not have taken those risks so far, but there's the one emotional tripwire certainly seems to be Crimea, whether it be this surface drone attack that took place over the weekend, or whether it was the attack on the Crimean bridge a couple of weeks ago. And that, President Putin may be willing to accept a lot of things in eastern Ukraine where he's, claimed annexations, but the Crimea seems to be a red line for him. Would you agree? And some people have said it is a matter of time before the Crimea itself comes under attack by probably some of these big HIMARS systems that the Ukrainians have.
So that's interesting. I've been reading it the opposite way. When they claim to have annexed indeterminate parts of Ukraine, there was some question about, okay, well, does that mean that they're going to view attacks on these territories as attacks on Russia? To which the response is, well, they haven't viewed attacks on Crimea, or actually, for that matter, attacks on Russia itself, as existential. So yes, they can say that they will respond, as they have responded to attacks on Crimea, as they have responded to the continuing war in the east and in the south, as they have responded in some cases to attacks in Russia. Is Crimea different from Belgorod, which is in legal Russian borders? I don't see why it would be. The Ukrainians have taken pains not to use HIMARS, American-provided HIMARS, in Ukraine against in Crimea against Crimea, or against Russian territory, as far as I can see. Well,
I think that was the deal, and spoken openly about by the Americans, that you cannot use HIMARS and that's why they haven't given them the longer range ATACMS, which hook onto the HIMARS to attack Russia itself, because that would be
but Crimea is not
Crimea is a big question.
Crimea is not Russia itself.
Really?
I don't
what
know.
Is it?
Crimea is Ukraine.
Since 2014, it's a legal part of Russia, according to the Russians, anyway.
Well, according to the Russians, some, but not all, unclear how much of Donetsk is also a part of Russia, but nobody can tell you where the borders of that are. I mean, Russia could claim that Alaska is a part of Russia. Would that make Alaska a part of Russia? No, it would not. So, occupation does not make something a part of a country, and saying that something is a part of that country, even if you don't occupy it, definitely doesn't. According to all international law, Crimea is a part of Ukraine.
I know that you're focused on eventually seeing the crisis end. I mean, that's what the International Crisis Group does, right? You want to see wars and conflict end. Do you think that President Putin has gone out of his way not to say where these borders of this new annexed area, which you just referred to, the fact that he hasn't absolutely drawn that on a map, that's important for the future discussions on how this will, hopefully eventually end somehow?
No, because to say that that's important for how it ends would be to assume that Russia would hold on to parts of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, even if you don't know what those parts are. So I think it's a very dangerous deal in which Russia succeeds in this war by gaining control of Ukrainian territory. In the end, it is up to Russia and Ukraine to make whatever deal they make. And, if you're just speculating wildly, right, you could say, consider a deal where Russia gets a little bit bigger, but is forced to say demilitarize, right? But nobody is having that conversation right now. That is a conversation that happens when the war is over. And there's really no appetite at all in Ukraine to give up any territory that is legally Ukrainian. And on the one hand, negotiating positions are negotiating positions and they change. On the other hand, if you look at the public opinion polling in Ukraine, I find it really hard to see a Ukrainian government survive giving up territory when something like 99% of the population opposes doing so.
Even as we're seeing just today, 50 cruise missile strikes on Ukraine, on civilian areas, targeting things like power and water, and 80% of Kiev, as we're doing this interview, doesn't have water right now. They may get it switched back on, but surely that's demoralizing to the public.
It is not demoralizing in the sense that it's making people think, wow, we should give up some territory to make the Russians stop. If anything, it's the opposite. So it's unpleasant, but it makes the Ukrainians angrier, not more willing to cut deals.
Olga Oliker with the International Crisis Group. Olga, always great to talk to you, and I really do appreciate your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You didn't agree with me on anything.